It started like any other day. I walked through the door after work, expecting the usual routine: dinner, a quiet evening with my wife, and maybe some TV. Instead, I was met with the unexpected sound of the front door slamming open. Kimberly stumbled in, her hair disheveled, her makeup smudged, and her coat clinging to her like an afterthought. She reeked of alcohol, her words slurred into an incoherent mutter about a wild night out. I stared at her, frozen, as she swayed on unsteady feet. Then she slipped off her coat, and my breath caught. She wasn't wearing anything underneath. Nothing. She didn't seem to notice or care. With a half-laugh, half-mumble, she stumbled to the couch and collapsed. Her body sprawled awkwardly as if she'd forgotten what normal decency was. Her phone slid out of her hand and landed on the cushion next to her. For a moment, I just stood there, my mind racing. The shock of the scene in front of me froze my body, but inside, everything churned. The sinking feeling in my gut was immediate. This wasn't just a drunken mistake. There was something more, something festering beneath the surface, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I moved closer, each step deliberate. Kimberly was out cold, her breathing slow and uneven. I reached for my own phone, the idea forming in my mind almost subconsciously. I didn't want to embarrass her or degrade her, but the need to document this moment felt overwhelming. It wasn't just about her lying there. It was about everything that had led to this point. All the late nights, the vague excuses, and the cold distance that had crept into our marriage. I snapped a few photos of her on the couch, my hands steady and my mind racing. I glanced down at her phone, still lying next to her. It was so close, almost beckoning me to pick it up. For now, I left it where it was, but the decision to take those photos lingered with a heavy finality. I didn't know what I'd do with them. I only knew one thing for certain. This night was a turning point, and whatever came next would change everything. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at Kimberly's passed-out form. Her chest rose and fell steadily, completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. The phone lay beside her, screen dark, but the weight of its presence felt oppressive. For months, I'd been piecing together fragments of unease. Her late nights, the vague excuses, the way she'd pull away when I tried to get close. I'd chalked it up to stress, maybe boredom, but tonight, all the excuses felt like a lie. I reached for the phone, my hand hovering for a moment. I hesitated, not out of fear, but because I knew this was a line I couldn't uncross. Whatever I found, there'd be no coming back. My mind waged a brief war. Was I ready to know the truth? The answer came quickly, with cold clarity. I picked it up and tapped the screen. The phone came to life, and almost immediately, a notification appeared. Asterisk, had an amazing time tonight. Can't wait to see you again. Chris. Asterisk. My chest didn't ache. Instead, there was a kind of icy stillness, a calm before the inevitable storm. I unlocked the phone, she'd never bothered to change the passcode, and opened her messages. The thread with Chris was right there, bold and glaring at me. I tapped on it, and the first few lines of their conversation stopped me cold. Asterisk, I loved the way you looked at me tonight. God, I wish we had more time. Asterisk. Asterisk, me too, baby. Next time, let's skip the drinks and head straight to my place. Asterisk. My jaw tightened. I scrolled further, my thumb moving almost mechanically, and the story began to unfold. Weeks of messages. Flirty banter turned into explicit promises. Photos of them together, some in bars, others clearly taken in private moments. Moments that left no room for doubt. Plans to meet up on nights she'd told me she was, catching up with the girls. It wasn't just physical. The tone of their texts was emotional, intimate. He wasn't just a fling. He was the man she'd been confiding in, the man she turned to when she should have been turning to me. The more I read, the colder I felt. There wasn't rage, not yet. Just a steely determination to see it all through, to understand the scope of what she'd done. I swiped through every message, every photo, absorbing the evidence like a prosecutor preparing for trial. The most recent exchange hit me the hardest. "I hate leaving you like this," Chris had written earlier that evening. Asterisk, "I'll make it up to you," Kimberly had replied. "You know you're worth it." Asterisk. I set the phone down and stared at her, still sprawled on the couch. For months, I doubted myself, blamed my own insecurities for the growing distance between us. But here it was, laid out in brutal clarity. My instincts hadn't been wrong. I'd trusted her, fought to believe her, and she'd turned that trust into a joke. My hands were steady now. There was no shaking, no hesitation. The path forward was becoming clear. Tonight, the truth had come out, and there was no burying it again. Whatever happened next, I was ready. When Kimberly finally stirred the next morning, I was already in the kitchen, sitting at the table, waiting. Her coat hung on the back of a chair, a silent reminder of the spectacle from the night before. Her phone sat in the middle of the table, next to a steaming cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking. My phone, with the photos I'd taken, rested in my pocket. Every detail of the scene was deliberate. She shuffled into the room, her movements slow and unsteady. Her hair was a tangled mess, and the fog of the previous night was evident in her glassy eyes. She looked at me, confused at first, before noticing the phone on the table. Her gaze flickered between me and it, her confusion morphing into something else. "Morning," she mumbled, her voice hoarse. "Who's Chris?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. My voice was calm, measured, but unyielding. There was no room for deflection. She froze mid-step, her face tightening as if she'd been physically struck. "What?" she asked, a weak attempt to buy time. "You heard me," I said, my eyes locked on hers. "Who is Chris?" Her mouth opened and closed, her brain clearly scrambling for an answer. "I don't know what you're talking about," she finally said, her voice shaky, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. I leaned back in my chair, nodding slowly. "You don't know? Maybe I should refresh your memory." I reached for her phone and slid it across the table toward her. "The texts, the photos, the plans. You've been seeing him for months, haven't you?" Her hand hovered over the phone but didn't pick it up. "It's not what it looks like," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not what it looks like." I repeated, the disbelief clear in my tone. "I've read every message, Kimberly. Every single one. He's not just some friend, is he?" She flinched at my words, her composure cracking. "We're just talking," she said weakly. "It's nothing serious. Just talking." I shot back, my voice rising slightly. "You've been sneaking out, lying to my face, meeting him behind my back, and you call that just talking?" "Don't insult me, Kimberly." Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it again. But then she sighed, her face crumpling as tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice trembling. "What didn't you mean for?" I pressed. "The lies. The sneaking around? Or the part where you decided our marriage wasn't worth being honest about?" She sank into the chair across from me, burying her face in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she sobbed. "But it did," I said, my tone unwavering. "So tell me, Kimberly, why? Why him? Why any of this?" She hesitated, then looked up at me, her face red and streaked with tears. "I don't know," she whispered. "I was lonely. You've been so distant lately, so focused on work. I felt invisible." "Invisible," I repeated, incredulous. "I've been working to keep this house running, to give us a life, and you felt invisible? That's what you're going with." "It's not just that," she said, her voice rising defensively. "You're always so serious, so controlling. With him, I felt free, like I could just be myself." Her words hit like a slap, but I refused to let them show on my face. "So instead of talking to me, your husband, about how you were feeling, you decided to go behind my back and find freedom with someone else?" She opened her mouth but didn't respond. I gave you every chance, I continued. I asked you about the late nights, the distance, and every time, you lied. You made me feel like I was crazy, like I was imagining things. I didn't know how to tell you, she said quietly. You didn't know how to tell me, I repeated, leaning forward. But you knew how to text him. You knew how to meet him. You knew how to betray me. Her face crumpled again, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered. I don't know what else to say. Sorry, I said, shaking my head. Sorry doesn't fix this, Kimberly. Sorry doesn't erase the lies or the betrayal. Sorry doesn't make me forget that you chose him over me. She reached across the table, her hand trembling. Please, we can fix this. I'll stop. I'll block him. We can go to therapy. No, I interrupted firmly, pulling my hand away before she could touch me. Therapy only works when there's honesty, and you've proven you're not capable of that. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her hands, silent. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I deserve better than this, I said, my voice steady. I'm not going to beg you to love me, and I'm not going to fight for a marriage you've already given up on. What are you saying? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying it's over, I said simply. I'll pack my things and leave today. You'll hear from my lawyer soon. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought she might argue, but she didn't. She just sat there, tears streaming down her face, as I walked out of the room. The weight of the confrontation lingered as I packed my bag. There was no satisfaction in being right, no relief in exposing her lies. Just a heavy, exhausting sense of finality. Whatever love we'd shared was gone, replaced by the cold, hard truth of her choices. By the time I closed the door behind me, I knew there was no going back. Kimberly had made her decision, and now I was making mine. After she left the room, I stayed at the table, staring at the phone she had left behind. Its dark screen reflected a warped version of my face, a face I barely recognized anymore. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like eternity as a storm of emotions churned inside me. The first to rise was anger, a fiery, consuming rage at her betrayal. It was white-hot, and for a moment, all I could think about was how casually she had destroyed everything we had built. But anger is fleeting. It burns fast and bright, leaving behind nothing but ash. What came next was far heavier, a deep, soul-crushing sadness that wrapped itself around me and refused to let go. It wasn't just about her infidelity, though that was devastating enough. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. I thought about all the times I had trusted her, the moments I had ignored my instincts because I didn't want to seem paranoid or controlling. I thought about every time I'd asked her about her late nights and her vague answers, the way she'd laugh it off and call me overprotective. I'd believed her, wanting to see the best in her even when my gut screamed at me not to. Now, all of those moments felt like knives, stabbing at me with the cruel clarity of hindsight. The memories flooded in uninvited. The first time we'd met, how her laugh had lit up the room. The quiet mornings we'd spent together, sipping coffee and talking about nothing in particular. The plans we'd made, the dreams we'd shared, all of it felt like a cruel joke now. How much of it had been real? Had she ever truly loved me, or had I been a placeholder, a convenience? I rested my elbows on the table, my hands gripping the edge as I tried to keep the weight of it all from crushing me. The betrayal wasn't just about Chris. It wasn't just about the texts, the photos, or the nights she'd spent with him. It was about every choice she'd made leading up to that moment. Every lie she'd told, every excuse she'd crafted, every time she'd looked me in the eye and chosen deception over honesty. For the first time in hours, I let myself breathe deeply. The initial shock had worn off, and with it came a grim sort of clarity. This wasn't something that could be fixed. Trust isn't something you can patch up like a broken fence. It's a foundation, and once it's gone, the entire structure collapses. The life we'd built together wasn't just cracked, it was shattered beyond repair. I couldn't imagine sitting across from her at the dinner table, pretending everything was fine. I couldn't imagine lying in bed next to her, knowing what she'd done. Most of all, I couldn't imagine ever trusting her again. I stood up from the table, pacing the room as my thoughts continued to spiral. Part of me wanted to blame myself. Maybe I hadn't been attentive enough. Maybe I'd worked too many late nights or hadn't noticed the signs soon enough. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that none of that mattered. She had made her choices. She had decided, time and again, to betray me instead of coming to me with whatever she was feeling. I stopped in front of the window, looking out at the street below. The world outside was so quiet, so normal, it almost felt surreal. How could everything out there be the same when everything inside me had changed so drastically? The dog padded into the kitchen, his nails clicking against the tile. He looked up at me with big, questioning eyes, as if he could sense the shift in the air. I knelt down and scratched behind his ears, feeling a pang of guilt. He didn't deserve this chaos. None of us did. "I'm sorry, buddy," I murmured. "You deserve better than this too." The weight of the situation pressed down on me again, but this time, it brought with it a sense of resolve. I couldn't stay here, not like this. Staying would mean living in the shadow of her betrayal, constantly questioning every word she said, every move she made. It would mean sacrificing my self-respect, my dignity, for a relationship that no longer existed. I walked back to the table and sat down again, this time with a pen and paper in front of me. I began making a list, what I needed to pack, who I needed to call, what steps I needed to take to untangle our lives. The act of writing was grounding, a reminder that even in the midst of chaos, I still had control over my own actions. The sadness didn't disappear. It lingered, a heavy ache in my chest. But alongside it, a new emotion began to take root: determination. This wasn't the end of my life. It was the end of a chapter, a painful, gut-wrenching chapter, but a chapter nonetheless. As I sat there, finishing the list, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let this break me. I'd grieve, I'd process, but I wouldn't let her choices define me. I'd find a way to move forward, to rebuild, to heal. By the time the sun began to rise, casting soft light across the room, I felt a strange sense of peace. Not because the pain was gone, it wasn't. But because I knew I had made my decision. Kimberly had chosen her path, and now I was choosing mine. I looked at the phone one last time, its screen still dark and silent. Then I pushed it away and got up to start packing. It was time to move on. By the time the afternoon sun started to stream through the kitchen windows, I had made my decision. There was no room for hesitation, no lingering doubts. I walked into the bedroom and grabbed my suitcase from the closet, the sound of the zipper cutting through the heavy silence of the house. As I packed, I mentally cataloged the steps ahead. Calling a lawyer, finding a new place to live, and beginning the process of severing the ties that had once bound us together. This wasn't a decision I had ever imagined making. When I'd said, "I do," I meant it. I had believed in us, in the promises we made to each other. But the foundation of trust had been ripped apart, and no amount of glue could hold together something so irreparably broken. I wasn't leaving because it was easy. I was leaving because staying would destroy whatever strength I had left. Before walking out, I sat down at the kitchen table one last time, the memories of the confrontation from earlier that morning still fresh. Kimberly had retreated to the bedroom after pleading for another chance, but her words had been hollow, her apologies too late. I hadn't gone after her. There was nothing left to say. I opened my phone and typed out a message to a lawyer whose number a friend had given me months ago, ironically, during a casual conversation about prenuptial agreements. The message was short and to the point. Asterisk, I need to discuss filing for divorce. Can we meet this week? Asterisk. After sending the text, I took a deep breath. The weight of what I was about to do pressed heavily on my chest, but underneath it, I felt something else: resolve. For too long, I had been questioning my instincts, doubting my worth, and ignoring the cracks in our relationship. No more. The next few days were a whirlwind of logistics. I moved into a friend's spare room, filling the space with the bare minimum: a few clothes, my laptop, and some essentials. The house I'd once called home felt like a distant memory, a place I could no longer associate with comfort or stability. Every spare moment was spent untangling our lives. I canceled joint accounts, forwarded my mail, and blocked her on social media. It was both cathartic and exhausting, like pulling weeds from a garden that had long since been overrun. Each step was a reminder of the life we had shared and the future we would never have. The nights were the hardest. Lying awake in an unfamiliar bed, I couldn't help but replay everything in my mind: the good times, the laughter, the small moments of happiness that had once defined us. But every memory was tainted now, overshadowed by her betrayal. I leaned heavily on my closest friends during this time. They didn't judge me for leaving or question my decision. Instead, they offered support, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this. Their encouragement helped me navigate the murky waters of heartbreak and uncertainty. As the weeks turned into months, I began to focus on rebuilding. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, a space that felt like a fresh start. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a place where I could begin to heal. I threw myself into work, picked up old hobbies I had neglected, and started prioritizing my own well-being for the first time in years. Reflecting on everything, I realized how fragile trust truly is. It's not something that can be easily repaired once broken. Love, while powerful, isn't enough to sustain a relationship on its own. It requires honesty, commitment, and mutual respect, none of which Kimberly had shown me. The experience taught me hard but valuable lessons about relationships and self-worth. I learned that no matter how much you love someone, you can't make them choose you. I learned that staying in a toxic situation doesn't make you stronger, it only makes you lose yourself. And most importantly, I learned that walking away isn't a sign of failure. It's a declaration of self-respect. Now, I'm in a place where I can look forward instead of back. The pain hasn't disappeared entirely, but it's dulled, replaced by a quiet sense of hope. I know I'll be okay, that this isn't the end of my story. It's just the end of a chapter, a painful, messy chapter that needed to close so I could begin again. For anyone reading this who has been through something similar, my advice is simple. Don't settle for someone who chooses lies over loyalty. Don't let fear of the unknown keep you in a situation that drains your spirit. Walking away is painful, but sometimes it's the only way to find peace. Do you think I made the right choice by leaving? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective means more to me than you might realize.